given what you just heard from the folks that you were sitting with, what seems to be, what's rising as a source of energy or insight?
My name is Marcus. So actually, recently I moved out onto a little goat ranch and helping out there. But I have two questions. One is just really practical, and then a more serious one. But you mentioned straw bale building and all these different things that you're kind of experimenting with on the farm and have been for a long time, and composting toilets. And I wondered if you just how do your neighbors interact with that, and have you gotten any pushback from that stuff? And then my second question is, thinking as a young person, lots of friends who would love to be more involved in agriculture, but as you mentioned, those questions about access to land and and how, if you have any words about how young people can pursue that ethically, and maybe what roles I don't know, communities like this can play.
Okay, thank you for both of those questions. When we started to experiment with straw bale construction and composting toilets, it was very early on, and it was not in the mainstream at all. But we felt our land mass was large enough that we, no matter what happened, it wouldn't even affect the neighbors. So we decided we were going to go for it and try to go through all the proper channels with the planning board and the zoning board and the meeting the codes that the building inspectors would have. And it took a lot of patience and a lot of time and conversation talking with township officials about all of this, because when I first went, they laughed. They thought everything was funny as can be. And they didn't take us at all seriously. So it was not easy. This is a very, very conservative area, and people are so slow to change out here. We're in it was a rural area. It's becoming suburbanized to some degree, and we're losing our farming infrastructure. But it's also very conservative, very Republican, very slow to change, I would say. So, so by giving them packets of materials, stopping off a town hall and saying, you know, I just found another article, I thought you might be interested in this. It was a slow process of just helping them to see models or photographs that were beautiful. Never give somebody something that's not going to be engaging or attractive. That's number one. And then information on the savings in terms of insulation properties that are part of straw bale. So it was always providing something they could think about. And so we went through that process, but we had to get necessary permits, fire, plumbing, everything. And we did. We were able to do it. And we knew that once we broke through, that it was going to make it possible for others to do that after us. And in one instance, we had an open workshop in which we invited all of the lumber yards in the region, all the architects and builders in the region to come for a day and actually work on putting up the wall of one of the straw bale houses.
Oh, wow.
And they came and they learned, and it's been taken seriously. And as an aside, this is a movement now that's all over the world. I mean, it has been that way. We certainly didn't start it, but we were early on in it. And especially in New Jersey, we were the first ones. But the movement has matured to such a degree that codes have been written for building indexes, and the state by state have to approve those. And then it makes it possible for anyone who comes in with a plan that were designed to do straw bale The town can't say no because they're prejudiced. They have to say yes because it meets all the code requirements. And New Jersey passed that last fall. So it's a done deal. And there was a law passed before we came here about composting toilets. So when we applied for the permit, we went to the Department of Health, met all the requirements. And so people who've come here just take it for granted now. And now our park systems, I don't know about out west, but in our park systems, many of them have restroom facilities with Clivus Multrum kinds of composting toilets. So it's not as foreign as it used to be. I believe it should be mandatory that any new building going up would have composting toilets. Why we think we are entitled to flush fresh water, take away our waste is another question that borders on indicating we're insane. Especially with water in the crisis it's in. So it should be mandatory. So what I'm saying to religious communities is get out there and do it. Show it can be done and do it well and bring beauty into it. As much time and thought and money into doing that as you would into redesigning the living room and the other general area. We have to just change our priorities. And for young people like you who want to come back to the land, it's a slow process of working out letters of agreement. I mean, the sister, if it's here, we have to be very careful about incorporating into whatever agreements we make that there's no fooling around. You use a chemical on this property and you're out. You forfeit your right. You may not be part of the damaging of this planet. And whatever you do, and have very strong criteria. And then we work to the next step. And it must be beautiful. Don't come here and create a place where, you know, people are going to hang out and make a mess of things. It has to be beautiful. Beauty should be as essential. I don't mean money-based beauty. I mean good design and care and simplicity. So that it's a beautiful project. Otherwise, not going to fly. And we're trying to convince people that they can give up their McMansion and move into a smaller house built by your neighbor. I mean, your farmer grows your house. That's our plan. We plan for that river valley to have all kinds of very visible examples of beautiful straw bale, modest housing for young families, anybody. No more McMansions.
Marcus builds tiny homes and lives in one.
Very great, yeah. That's a little, now I'm gonna say something because I really love tiny homes and have spent a lot of time making small spaces very beautiful. But it's going to be for a very few people who will live in tiny houses, as I've seen them coming online. So it's not for everybody. And I suspect there'll be divorces over it. So, you know, we just have to, you know, do it, but don't think it's, right now, I don't think it's going to be the norm. I think we have to ease into something, especially in these days when people need a little more private space because space is so hard to find, psychic space.
My name is Martha Miriam, and I am a co-member in the Loretto community. And I would appreciate if you could talk a little bit more about a statement you made just a little while ago. You said religious groups need to put land into preservation. Loretto right now has two pieces of property, one in St. Louis and one where we are today, that we have decided to sell. And then we also have the Loretto Mother House, and we have other small houses. And what I'd like you to speak to is if your community, or if you know of other communities who have sold buildings but not the property, and have put the property into preservations or trusts that would last 7 generations. And it just, that's what I'm wondering.
It's a hard issue, and thank you for raising that, because we've been working with a number of congregations for a long time. For a long time, there's been a group of women religious who have been at this. And my fear is that communities have waited too long. So now we're all old ladies and need lots of care and blah, 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 blah. And so now the concern is we have to get the money, because in this country you need a fortune to die. And it's crazy. It's just crazy. But I'm exaggerating a little bit, but on the other hand, I'm not. And I think as far as religious go, we need to take a long, hard look at the kind of care that we think we should get. I'm not quite sure it's thought through.
What does that mean?
Well, in terms of very, very expensive medication, very expensive procedures to continue the dying process. And I'm not, we all are going to die, and we should all die comfortably and without pain. I'm not sure the prolongation of life, to the extent it happens in this country, is very thought through. And I think it affects everybody, because the doctors feel this way, the hospitals feel this way, the insurance company, I mean, it's out of control. But also, I think that the renovation and restoration, or selling property to build facilities where we're going to have this type housing and this type of care, sometimes I think it's a little over the top. It's not what most people on the planet can afford. I don't know why we feel we're entitled to that. And it's not, I'm trying not to be overly critical, but I've seen decisions made that way, and it raises questions for me. So I think our care should be very, very simple, frugal, and beautiful, but not the kind of beauty that I see sometimes in how places are designed. So there's a community I've been working with for probably 20 years on land issues, and they just made a unilateral decision to sell 2 of their major properties. One is so major that it's heartbreaking, because they have to care for their elderly. They will not make friends of the people around them. And that land will get developed.
So any experiences you've had in helping people get earth-centering rituals and ways they can find that one-to-one connection with Earth is certainly of interest.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it really is a challenge to be able to provide experiences for people who live in urban areas and high rises and so alienated from, nature in a more in a bigger way. And it seems to be a growing trend that all around the planet, this move towards urbanization and high rises in blocks and blocks and blocks of high rise apartments. I don't know where that is coming from. I'm suspecting it's about, well, we have to house all these people and we need open space for growing food or whatever, although I don't think it's always about growing food. But it feels counter life to me. I just don't know. I don't think it's a good idea, but I'm not a city designer. But for people who are in cities and so removed from nature, there does seem to be a renewal of the part of cities to create more parks and green spaces. And but how do you attract young people who are up on the 35th floor playing games and in their phones and digital, into the digital world? How do you break that? I don't know, but it is worrisome. It's very worrisome. And not only kids living on the 30th floor, but kids everywhere. They're so hooked into electronics. I think we all should be extremely worried. So spaces that can be opened and available for young people, children to come and play, I think are critical. And having said that, I'll just tell you a little bit about our experience here. We have been working with a group called Project Use for many years, since the late 80s, I believe. And Project Use, USE, is Urban Suburban Experience. So these kids are typically kids from schools in inner city, but Project Use would bring them out here. We were one of about 4 different sites that they had where they would come and give the kids a whole day experience. And the kids would get off the bus and go out into the woods, and we wouldn't see them till the end of the day. And they had all kinds of wilderness and self-discovery kind of exercises and stuff for them to do. And I know that had a deep impact on those children. Our CSA has a summer camp for children. And so they help in the big garden. But schools come out on a regular basis to Genesis Farm for the children to have the experience of gardening. And it's beautiful to see that. And the children love it. They love it. It just, I don't know, they take to that naturally. So our place is available. It's very open to any group that wants to have experiences here. Kids come out and they camp, from schools. We have a charter school created nearby by a group of parents from our local, friends. And it's I think it's in its 12th year now, but it's a public school, fully public school, all the requirements, but it's a charter school and its curriculum is based on the universe story. And these children, there's no sports program, but there's expeditions. So they're always out on trails, up the river, down the river, doing all kinds of learning experiences, including gardening on their school grounds. But your question is, it's an important question. How do we make spaces available for children who have so little opportunity to hear birdsong or just be in the wild or in the natural world? I don't know. I don't know how we ever got this bad. Except we think progress is other things. But there are a lot of curricula that have been developed over the last 20, 30 years that I know of about how to bring children back into the natural world and rekindle that sense of awe.
Thank you.
Our little group, when we were discussing, too, talked about land and ownership of land and putting land in trust. And one in our group talked about her ancestors, getting a land grant from the King of Spain, but how does the King of Spain, how did the King of Spain own land out here in the west of the United States? We just took the land from the Native Americans, but the Native Americans themselves didn't believe that they owned lands. They used the land and reverenced the land. And then we talked about a 19th century philosopher who had the idea that we don't own land and that the land is a sacred trust for all of us, and that we should all pay rent for the land that we use, and that the rent should be then given in the hands of some governmental organization that would distribute that rent money for social services, for education, for health, for the welfare of people. So that's a wonderful concept, and maybe we thought the way to get that concept going is to advocate, as you were saying, that religious communities and others put our land in trust, because we don't own the land. It's a sacred trust, and we as religious communities can lead the way. And I'm a Loretto, and I know we talked about that in Loretto, about putting our mother house, the grounds, in trust. And I don't know where that is. And another Loretto said, oh, we've done that, or we put part of it in trust. But I guess, at least speaking from this one Loretto, I need to hear where we are in that process of putting our lands in trust. So thank you for bringing up that concept of religious communities putting lands in trust for future generations.
Yeah. And the movement, the land trust movement, is growing by leaps and bounds. So you have public land trusts and you have private land trusts. So in our instance, there are public land trusts that are part of the state's attempt to preserve land in perpetuity. So they buy up land for parks, future parks, for recreation, for wildlife, for scenic rivers, for farmland preservation. And so the state has a number of initiatives for that, and they're well worth looking into. We sold our development rights to the state of New Jersey Farmland Preservation Program. In addition to public, like that, state-owned or government-owned, you also have private land trusts, like the Nature Conservancy. They're big, big land trusts. That's a national one. Trust for Public Land. Well, they're all over the place. I mean, and alliances of land trusts. And every state, if you were to go into Google and just look Land Trust Alliance, up would come a beautiful website, and it would give you, according to your state and your region, all of the public and private land trusts or conservancies that already exist. They're your best advisors. So what I would recommend is that you create some sort of a committee in the community that's willing to look at this for a good, long, serious look. And part of what you do is you invite those land conservancies in to give you a presentation on what is the particular characteristic of their organization, how does it work, and how do they partner with others in order to preserve Loretto's lands. You'll be amazed at how much help you'll get, because they want to save it in perpetuity. And then you are able to dictate the terms on which people can lease your land or rent your land for particular objectives that are in alignment with your charism.
Thank you.
Okay.
Miriam, I'm Mary Catherine Rabbit. I'm a member of the Loretto community, Sister of Loretto, and I mentioned the environmental justice issue last night. And one of the things I wanted to go back to, which we didn't get a chance to talk with Fletcher about, is this whole notion of kind of reestablishing a conservation corps in the United States that would be, oriented toward low-income minority kids who don't have that experience of being, having any opportunity to be out in the, in the woods and out in nature. And is there any role for religious communities in kind of helping to shape that? I sense some, some possibilities with Hillary of looking in that direction. And I just think we could be helpful. I mean, AmeriCorps has used a lot of our properties over time, and whether there would be something like that, kind of a conservation corps, where we could even house some of these folks in our own facilities and provide opportunities for building trails, for building bridges, for all of that kind of infrastructure.
There is, and it's part of the American tradition to do that, because what happened during the Depression. I mean, the American Conservation Corps was designed, and some of the most beautiful structures and roads and walls and aquifers and reservoirs were constructed by putting people to work, bringing in real craftsmen, bringing them over from Italy to teach people how to do stonework, and it was across the infrastructure of the United States, and some of those projects still exist. They certainly exist around here. They're beautiful. But we have changed as a people since that time. I mean, there has been such a decline in a sense of the commons, the common good, by the neoliberal economic theories that have trickled down and colored American economic life. It's shocking. And so the withdrawal of monies from the common good has been a concerted effort on the part of particular groups of people in this country. So I'll talk about the Republican right, because in the 60s, after Barry Goldwater was defeated, a group of wealthy Republicans came together to decide how they were going to remove from history what we call the federal government. They did not believe in a federal government. And their strategy was to create the religious right, very, very conservative religious Christian right, and to create a way to influence them to become an enormous voter bloc. And so that was the birth of the televangelists and the breakfast at the White House and all of that sort of thing. And now this is so complicated and deep. I could spend all day with you, but I can't. But you can go online right now and just Google in theocracy watch. Theocracy watch. And it is a documented history of the rise of the religious right as a strategic tool of the Republican right to dismantle the federal government, take monies out of the commons, and redistribute it among private individuals and corporations. And everything that happened from Reagan on is right on schedule. The privatization of prisons, the privatization of schools, the privatization of waterworks. It's all part of a whole philosophical approach, and it is very, very frightening, and I don't know how much time we have left to undo it. We've been asleep. So theocracy watch.
Thank you.
Hello, Miriam. My name is Anna. I'm a Loretto member, and I'm just so grateful for what feels like such a radical approach to so much that we know about in our surroundings now. And so first, just thank you so very much for that. And, so my question is not about the land and land trust, it's about buildings on the land. And of course, religious communities are at this critical juncture where they're needing to do something about both. But recently I met a real estate man who said, if you have property, don't sell it. Don't get rid of it. Hang on to it. And I remember back in the days of Chuck, who did the land trust on the East Coast.
That guy, yeah, he was a
who used to talk all the time about what we had, we needed to pass on. not sell, but pass on for the common good. And so in addition to the land, or maybe splitting it up, as Martha suggested, land, property, what could you tell us about that?
Well, there are a number of different models of how we can preserve land in perpetuity for particular purposes, either to keep it untouched or to put it into a particular objective for the common good. And Chuck Mathai was brilliant at this because he really had a sense of the obligation we have to people who surround us, who have a stake in the well-being of that land, because if something happens to it, it impacts a lot of other people all the way into the future. And so his organization was the Community Land Trust. No, Equity Land Trust. And that still exists. Just Google it. Equity Land Trust. Now, there has been a movement in agrarianism that had its source in England in the early 1900s by a group of Catholic intellectuals. Remember G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc and Eric Gill and Vincent McNabb, who happened to have been a Dominican. They came together in the 1920s or 30s out of horror at the conditions, the squalid conditions of London and the slums and the tenements to which people were coming by the promises of industrialization and factory work. It almost emptied the countryside, and the conditions were terrible. And they formed a group of thoughtful people who began writing and publishing and having good public discourse about the ideas about private property and the rights, the necessity for people to live as close as they can to the land and be as self-sufficient as possible. Well, anyway, their movement floundered simply because the bishops of England did not provide them with some of the income they were hoping they would get to be able to purchase land and bring people from the city back to the land. It was a very powerful idea. You can go online. They call themselves the distributists, Catholic distributists. They affected so many people. And I've only really learned about them in the last 3 years or so, and I'm just amazed at how I can trace my own lineage as a land trust advocate back to them. And it's over years and people on the link of who affected me. And but anyway, they were trying to be faithful to two sources of inspiration. Rerum Novarum, written by Pope Leo XIII in 1873 or whenever it was, or 93, and St. Thomas Aquinas, the common good, the commons, the commons, the commons. Now, neither Thomas Aquinas or Pope Leo XIII had a sense of the evolution of the universe. If they did, their writings, I think, would have been way stronger in terms of creating a philosophical and ethical approach to land ownership. But they were both about the commons and the common good. And Leo, in his encyclical, said, we're trying to make a real case for the more people had access to land from which they could make a subsistence living, the stronger the culture would be, the economics would be, the family would be, the region would be. And it's amazing to discover that in there, because I always think of him about labor and unions and all of that, but this was in there too. And so anyway, this Catholic distributist movement really took that to heart and tried to bring as many people as possible back to the land and give them that availability. Because, and here was their philosophy: if you had enough acreage to have your own home, raise your children, to have cow or 4 acres, however they kind of figured it out, and you could be self-sufficient, you could, through the crafts and the guild system, learn how to live a noble and dignified life in that situation and have time for your own inner growth and the cultivation of the soul. As soon as you had no land, as soon as you leave the land, then you have to get a job, the wages. As soon as you're a wage earner, you are already a step into slavery because you have no control over the wage giver, the employer. So you have to earn money to get the same food that you would have had if you were growing it yourself. Now they had a lot of essays and stuff on this, which I find fascinating now. So they impacted a number of people in England, including E.F. Schumacher. Did you ever hear of E.F. Schumacher?
Sure.
Well, it's beautiful. He was so impressed by their logic, he actually became converted to Catholicism.
Wow.
It was beautiful. And was he really started the movement towards intermediate and alternative appropriate technology and the Back to the Land movement. He affected Kirkpatrick Sale. He affected the Catholic rural life movement. Bishop O'Hara, who was trying to move that along. They were too religious. Sorry, but it goes off. It goes in that tangent. But then they affected people like Ralph Borsodi, who was the founder of the School of Living, and Henry George, the economist who wrote Poverty and Progress in Poverty. He was a Catholic, and he ran for mayor of New York City, in fact. And Cardinal Gibbons in the late 1900s, ran him out of town. But these people had such insight into the necessity of the land being held in common. And they didn't go so far as to say no one should own private property. They were trying to say everybody should have a little bit of it. But what if it was held by the community in trust? And if you had use for that land, you would pay a lease. You could build a house on it. You could own the house. That's your work, your labor, your materials. But you never own the land under it. This is how the land trust movement really began. You can build and own your land and give it to your children in your will, but never the land. The land is held in the commons. Because when it's not, and it's all cut up among private landowners, and then the rich get lots and lots of land, and they make scarcity for the rest of the community, then rents go up, land values go up. But that's all artificial. That's market driven. And capitalism thrives on it. So my own sense is, now you're Lorettos, we make vows. We are not going to own private property ourselves. We hold it in common, but we all have what we need. It works. But you have to have some stability, so we make vows that we're going to be faithful to each other and to the bigger vision for which we came together as a community in the first place. You have to live for something bigger than yourself. And that's why it's worked. But nobody forced you into the congregation to take a vow of poverty and not own land. You did it freely. You did it freely because you were doing it for a meaning that you thought was worth the sacrifice. I know what I wrote on my application. I wanted to enter to save my soul and the souls of others. Because I still believed in the old idea of everybody dies and death is a punishment, and you get three choices. And they're all eternal. I mean, hell and heaven are eternal. I was petrified of that, losing people to hell. But it was enough motive for me to enter. But everybody in my age range, we all said the same thing.
You lasted all this time.
Because it was part of the worldview we held as though it was absolute truth.
Yeah.
Now I sense that desire to be about something greater than the self is in every single human person. Because you know why? Because nature does that. Nothing in nature says, I am here for myself. That tree outside my window is serving 1,000 different ways the community of life. Inherent in nature itself. So if we could take that pattern and bring it to another level of meaning, I think the whole country could enter into a consciousness that the land belongs to everybody, and we rearrange the way we distribute it and give access to it so everybody gets their needs met. It's not impossible. Somebody said it earlier. That's how the native peoples lived. They lived here for 11,000 years that way. They did fine. We're the ones that are caught in this tiny, tiny constrained worldview called capitalism.
Yeah.
And it's not inevitable. We can break out of it. And I think the best of capitalism, which is the freedom of the individual and the freedom to use initiative, is really important. Every interiority in the universe has a role to play. But the common good, which was promoted by communism at the expense of freedom of the individual and creativity of the individual, neither of them are adequate for providing a path to life. But if you take the best of both and you have a middle way, it's about the commons, everybody freely associating and making a free choice to have what one needs, but to do it for the common good. It's the essence of our vows. It's the essence of the golden rule. Do unto every other differentiated interiority what you would have them do to you. It just needs to be translated into another realm. Because your constitutions and my constitutions, they say that. So let's take the spirit and the logic and the beauty of that and translate it into a vision for our common lands. And then get the Nazareths to do it, and get St. Catherine to do it, and get the Trappists to do it. They're going to be the hardest ones, but and the diocese, like we should be countercultural to land ownership and monopolization. It's all sacred ground. It's all sacred.
My name's Andy, and thank you so much for sharing your bounty of wisdom with us. I am kind of wondering, with all of the non-patriarchy thoughts that you've had to encounter to get to where you are, if you've had any trouble with being a Catholic in all of that, since that's such a hierarchical, patriarchal structure, and how you've done that.
Oh, how I've done that. I'm not quite sure, but I've had a few moments. But I was so blessed from the beginning because when I think even before I came here, I'm not even sure, but I had only met Thomas 3-4 years before that. But he said, don't come at this through religion, come through science. And because no one's going to argue with you on science. But if you start coming through, is the book of Genesis right or is evolution right? That's it. You're going to just be crushed into the ground. It makes no sense to do that. So don't argue with religious people and don't come at it as a religious issue. And I remember during that time, Matthew Fox was in trouble and he had a great deal of good things to say. And he got caught in that hierarchical church thing. So I always tried to keep a low profile. It's a very, very conservative country. It isn't especially Catholic, heavily Catholic, but the local situation was really not, the local parish was really not endurable. So I just had to keep a very low profile. They would say, well, where do you go to church? And I said, well, I shop around, you know. Because nobody knew where I was, you know, but I didn't make an issue out of any of that. I wasn't out looking for a fight. So to me, the important thing was to do the work and to build the infrastructure for the farm and a learning center that could be at the service of this great work. So rarely did I come into conflict with anyone. I did once, but it wasn't I was visited by some chancellor of the new diocese, and I said the wrong thing, and so there was a follow-up investigation, and thank God, Sister Margaret Thomas, who I showed you before, she went with me and she's got a canon lawyer, and the three of us went to visit the bishop. And it was very cordial, and we left with the bishop happy, and we were happy. And no conflict, we just slid through all of the craziness. I did find myself in a great deal of trouble once when I went to New Zealand, and unbeknownst to me, there had been a movement in this country to translate my tapes. I had produced a lot of audio tapes in the 80s and early 90s. You know, I never even thought about them. They just were out. We weren't even promoting them. They just were out there. And, but apparently there had been people in this country that were translating all my presentations. And they sent them to New Zealand, where this theologian wrote a letter to all of the bishops of New Zealand and major superiors not to allow me in the country.
Oh, wow.
I arrived with that on the front page of the Wellington Times.
Oh my
I was shocking. I couldn't grasp it. I just was really shocked. So what happened as a result of that is that attendance at all the presentations like tripled.
Oh, yeah, right, absolutely.
I don't come on confrontational, especially then I didn't. Might be a little more direct now, but I wasn't. And it just fell apart like embers on a dying fire. So I think this is what I would say: focus on the story of how things came to be. Study the evolutionary process, study it, not in depth. We're not going to be specialists, but get a feel. That's what Thomas would say to me. Get the feel of it, get the feel of the sequence. Know enough that you're absolutely stunned by the magnificence of it. And then when you need to get more information on one particular thing or another, you can find that. There are experts in that. You don't have to be an expert. And then the integration of that into one's faith experience becomes not as difficult, because you're not giving up your faith. You're absorbing your faith and coming out of that in you as a gift out of which you evolve to deal with the revelations of the universe story. See? It's a very different. You don't try to fit the universe story into your faith. You allow your faith to enable you to penetrate into the universe story and what's needed now in the ecological realm and the cosmology and all these issues of land and health and war and sexism and the terrible things we do to each other. The root cause of all of them is the same as the root cause of the destruction of Earth. We're not connected to the whole. We don't understand that differences are the answer, not the problem.
Hello, Miriam. Karen Cuddy. I Several years ago, you mentioned that you were becoming more immersed in your Celtic roots, the Celtic Christianity that seems to be so much more aligned with the natural world and with the lack of patriarchy, the lack of power over, the lack of separation, actually has a deep rootedness as well in the Christian tradition, but it's just not as well known. I just wonder if you might say something about that lineage that perhaps people can become more educated about and therefore maybe feel more comfortable with bridging the world between what is being revealed through science and what was also held deeply by Christians.
I was introduced to the notion of Celtic spirituality in the 80s by a Presbyterian minister who was working at a place not far from here. It led me to begin that exploration, and then for some strange reason, I was invited to Ireland to start to do some programs for religious communities. And I was at a place in Swords where the Christian Brothers had this center. And there was a brother Paulinus there who was really steeped in the ancient religions of Ireland. So I asked him about it, and he said, for God's sake, the Celts were invaders. Don't you think we had a religion before the Celts ever arrived? So my search into Celtic spirituality. So I said, okay, thank you. Let's think again. So then it turned out we became great buddies. And then maybe 2 years later, we team taught a 2-week institute in Ireland, bringing the universe story and the ancient Irish spirituality together. And they would maybe call that Gaelic rather than Celtic, because the Gaelic language was the same, and the tradition was the same in Scotland, especially in the islands, and in Wales and England. And it was just an early form of culture in which the earth, the sun, the moon were seen as deities. So if you go way back. So anyway, he was an incredible teacher. And so it gave me a whole new insight into the understanding of Ireland, the land mass, which was actually given names in the earliest place names of Ireland, were part of the anatomy of the goddess. Amazing, amazing stuff. And so that was a very rich experience, and I was just very blessed to go back to Ireland many times and work with some of that material, but especially with the Universe Story. And a lot of people from Ireland came to Genesis Farm. Then I had the experience of meeting an author by the name of Alistair McIntosh from Scotland, who wrote a book called Soil and Soul. And I was so moved by that book because he grew up on one of the Hebrides Islands off the coast of Scotland, and he grew up as the son of a physician in a feudal system. Because Scotland has one of the most antiquated land ownership laws in all of Europe. And he tells the story in this big, thick book of how a group of people came to him, because he now was an ecologist at the University of Edinburgh, to help them win rights back to the land of Harris, the island of Harris, and also of Eigg, E-I-G-G. It's a small but it's a very important island. And that's just background. I was so entranced with the book, I gave it to some activists that I was working with on a project in the Hudson River Valley. And they were so entranced by it, they invited Alistair McIntosh to come and talk to their group to stop this quarry from taking over like a mile-wide swath of the Hudson River waterfront, just as this quarry was going to take down the island of Harris and use the island to pave all the new roads in the EU. So Alistair came over, and then this friend of mine brought him to Genesis Farm on a trip going to visit different places, and he stayed for a night or two. And I invited all my neighbors and stuff and said, "You gotta hear this guy. This guy is really, he's so good." And I thought he was going to talk about what he did. And he didn't do that at all. He said, "You know, I've often wondered, maybe you can shed light on this, seeing this in our library. I often wonder why the Irish and Scottish Catholics and those who are oppressed, when they came to this country, never looked back or dealt with the trauma that they went through, because it was traumatic to leave during the famine or during the penal laws when Catholics in both countries were absolutely persecuted. It was unbelievable what Cromwell and the Crown did to Catholics." And he said, "I often thought it was so traumatic that they couldn't look back. They had to get on with life. So they buried the trauma. They didn't look at it and understand it and heal it and forgive. They just got on with life. And then they turned around and they became the oppressors here. And they did the same thing to the African Americans and the Chinese Americans and the Native Americans." He said, it's astonishing story of people fleeing from suffering, coming here, and why is it they weren't compassionate?
Yes.
And he said, "I think it's because we never went back and visited those traumas and those wounds and dealt with it and just resolved them." And as he's saying this, it was like clicking all sorts of stuff in me, because on both sides of my family, we left under terrible circumstances. My ancestors left under terrible circumstances. And I have a family in which alcoholism, addiction, depression, suicide, I mean, we're the poster family of the world. And I thought, oh, there is something to this. Something in the past that hasn't really been understood or addressed. And it goes into the unconscious. And Carl Jung would say, when you let the unconscious go that way and you don't resolve it, it becomes a driving force in your life, and it is the good one. So I decided I would really study my genealogy on both sides, and shared that with my 10 nieces and nephews and everybody, and spent years doing that research. To try to understand why this dysfunction. And believe me, that has a lot to do with how I'm seeing this new work in addiction. Because it wasn't just my families. You talk to all the Canadians whose ancestors came from Scotland and left in the same situation, or the Irish Americans, and you got it's the same scenario. So that's a long answer to your short question. But I think it's important for all of us to do that. And for all the people who are living in the trauma of today from their homelands, oh my God, it's just, I don't know how people deal with it. But even in our generation, before this most recent terrible situation, we haven't resolved what happened to our ancestors in Portugal and in Spain and in Germany and in Italy. We really haven't. So, and Thomas Berry, he's a historian. He gave me a very, very deep appreciation of how our inner lives are shaped by the stories we're given. And the stories we're given are given by ancestors who are making meaning out of their lives, as painful or difficult as they might be. And the inability to cope, which manifests in drug substance abuse and addiction. Bill W. and Carl Jung both said it's because the situation of the culture is such that creative, intelligent people, no matter how much they try, can't make it. And what happens is that creativity gets turned in on itself and becomes anger and despair. So I think it's important we all do it. And then we can hold up, the stories and understand that the soldiers that came from England to kill the Catholics, they didn't want to do that. They were conscripted into an army and forced to do it too. And war and violence brings out the worst in us. Somebody gets up in the morning and says, I want to be a killer.
Well, Marion, we're coming right to the end of our time, and I'm going to come around here so I can look at your face. And so I can just say, such a deep, deep thank you to you. Thank you so much for your very deep understanding of these issues. Thank you for sharing with us with such clarity and courage. Thank you for hanging with us through all of the technical difficulties. And thank you for helping us celebrate who we are and how we have come to this place, and really helping us think through how we might move into the future together. So if we could all thank Mary.
You took a big chance on letting me come, even though I wasn't coming physically. I am not flying anymore. Over, done, over. Yeah. So this is the only way I can, be part of other people's things as I used to do it when I flew. So thank you for your trust in that, and I hope it wasn't too annoying with the.
No, we made it work. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.